Hello and welcome back to lecture 3 where we're talking about clarity, specifically tied to meaning. So we'll call this meaning and clarity. We'll look at, for starters, the principle of charity, and then we'll talk about ambiguity and vagueness in sentences. We'll talk about grammatical ambiguity. We'll talk about descriptive and evaluative meaning. Then we're going to look at necessary and sufficient conditions, and then we will conclude. I'll draw some conclusions. This is the final, I would say, foundational lecture. So we're still taking baby steps at this point, but you need to understand clarity and meaning. There's some really foundational concepts here, but when we're almost at the point where we can really start to assess arguments and reconstruct arguments. So bear with me for one last lecture of foundational work. And then we'll get into assessing arguments, reconstructing arguments in the next set of lectures. The first thing I want to talk about in this lecture is the principle of charity. And when we're looking at arguments, often enough, there's more than one way to understand what someone is saying and what the meaning of the argument is, or the meaning of a particular statement. And when we do this, we could sort of portray it in the least plausible way, right? To be to express as little charity as possible, to give a very implausible understanding of what someone's saying. And when we do that, it's really easy to disprove that person's argument, right? And so we got to be careful not to do that. What we want to do is actually offer the most plausible interpretation of a statement or an argument, one that is much more difficult to disprove. And so sometimes what we're doing when we're assessing arguments is reconstructing the arguments to understand what is actually going on. And when we have to do that, we have to be as charitable as possible. So, for example, someone might say, Donald Trump is always telling lies. Now, you could take that as literally as possible, that every time Donald Trump opens his mouth, a lie comes out. But do you think that's really what this person is saying? They might be saying that, but it seems slightly implausible, and you could really easily disprove that, right? You could just find one sentence that Trump says that you can prove is not a lie and say, look, you're wrong. Trump is not always telling lies. But if we use the principle of charity, we probably understand that what they mean is that Donald Trump is often telling lies, right? And so they might be using expressive language to say, or exaggerated language to express this fact that Donald Trump is often telling lies, which may be true or false. That's something you can sort of think through for yourself. But the point is that you want to be as charitable as possible when you're assessing someone's statements in argumentation, right? You might not think they deserve charity, but we're going to use the principle of charity anyways, because as we'll see, we're not so much interested in winning the debate in critical thinking. We're much more concerned with finding the truth, right? And so we need to be careful to be as charitable as possible. And I'll give you some guidelines on that as well. But for the most part, we need precision. And so when you're looking at arguments and the author of that argument is actually there with you, you can actually ask for precision. Like you can say, look, do you actually think Donald Trump is always lying, or do you mean like he's often telling lies? And usually you can get it from that. Sometimes we have to reconstruct it on our own. Sometimes we're reading, say, an argument, or we're seeing an argument in a video clip or something like that, and we have to just sort of assume what's going on in the background and then be as charitable as possible. But what we're looking for is precision. Now, I want to take a minute to just look at the principle of charity a bit more closely, and I'll define it here. So the principle of charity states that when there are multiple ways to understand what someone means, we ought to take the most plausible interpretation of that statement suggested by the context. So winning the debate is not the primary goal of critical thinking. As I said earlier, what we're trying to do is we're trying to find the best beliefs about the world, right? We're trying to find which positions and beliefs are the most plausible, right? And so we need to focus not on winning debates, right? My goal is not to teach you how to think critically so that you can just bully people into thinking how you think. But the point is to take a step back and dispassionately look at the most plausible views, positions, and beliefs out there, and then see which ones you think are, in fact, ones to be adopted, right? And we only do that by looking at the most charitable expression of positions, statements, and beliefs. So that's why it's important to adopt the principle of charity. So you must use this when debating an opponent. But along with this, we must ourselves make sure that we are being as clear as we can when we put our own arguments out there, so that we're not going to fall prey to someone who's uncharitable and who doesn't portray our arguments very well. If you've ever had any media coverage of anything you've said, you will know that media does not use the principle of charity. And we could discuss whether or not they should, but the fact is that they don't. And so they often twist and sort of change the way things are said. And it's kind of a big problem in today's society because the media has a lot of power to persuade and to give information. Although, of course, there is a lot of pushback in today's society. But just bear that in mind. We ought to have a principle of charity. But in fact, many don't. But that doesn't mean that we just lose the principle of charity ourselves. Logic and critical thinking says that in the long run, we'll win if we use the principle of charity because we will find the best arguments and we want to have the best arguments. So we shouldn't try to win a debate by being confusing ourselves or by trying to trick our opponents into accepting funny conclusions based off of some sort of confusing premise. Sorry about the typo here. Now, when we're talking about clarity, the opposite of clarity can be ambiguity or vagueness, but these are different concepts, and so it's good to get clear on what these two concepts are. So ambiguity is when a sentence has more than one possible meaning, so it has multiple meanings. And vagueness is when a sentence lacks a precise meaning. So there actually isn't options, it's just sort of a hazy idea. Now, first and foremost, we should always avoid ambiguity when reasoning because you don't want to give multiple options and make your audience guess of what does he mean or what does she mean, this or does she mean that, right? You want to be as clear as possible and avoid ambiguity. Vagueness is harder because sometimes you need to express a vague thought, but typically in critical thinking, we want to be as precise as possible. Here's an example of a vague sentence, just to be clear. Applicants must hold a diploma in early childhood education or have equivalent work experience. Now, the vagueness here comes in have equivalent work experience, right? So this, I guess, information for applicants is saying that you have to hold a diploma in early childhood education. That's very clear, right? You either do or you don't have that. Or they're saying have equivalent work experience, but I mean, that can mean almost anything. Like, does that mean you work for a daycare? Does that mean you have kids at home yourself? That can mean so many different things, and it doesn't actually mean anything, right? It's vague and it doesn't mean anything. So it lacks precise meaning, and that's why it's vague. And we do want to avoid that as much as possible in critical thinking. Here's another vague sentence. The fact that the Democrats won more seats in the Electoral College than any other party in the 1992 federal election shows that the voters wanted a Democratic government. So it's vague here because the word voters here is really unclear. Does it mean all the voters? Because that wouldn't be true. Does it mean the majority of voters? Because that might not be true, right? You can have in a US election, you could have where the majority of voters actually vote Republican, but then the Democrats actually win more seats in the electoral college. So it might not even mean most of the voters. It could mean some of the voters, but that's just confusing then, right? Because you're trying to, it looks like the sentence is trying to say, like, the voters wanted this, but it could be the fact that like less than half of the voters actually did want this, right? And so it's vague specifically in terms of the use of the voters, right? And we might want to ask, what's going on here? Do you mean all, most, or just some of these voters here? So that's an instance of vagueness. Here's another vague sentence. You might see this at a press conference, like, I don't know, some sort of police press conference. My officials are monitoring the situation very closely, and I can promise that we shall take all appropriate measures to ensure that the situation is resolved in a way that is fair to all parties. You might be right to ask, well, what are these appropriate measures, right? It looks like you're just saying nothing, right? Or what do you mean by fair, right? So we need to get clearer here, and it would be good to ask these sorts of questions if you're able to. Here's some concluding thoughts on vagueness, just in terms of critical thinking. Um, if you're in a debate and you hear something vague, always challenge it. Vague thinking, vagueness itself should always be challenged. And so precise thinking is almost always more valuable than vague thinking, especially when it comes to issues of critical thinking. Now you might think like there's some vague thoughts in like music appreciation. That's fine, and that might be important to you. But when we're talking about, say, politics or religion or science, we want to be as clear as we can, because it's more helpful, right? And so vagueness is, it's not like a sin or anything like that, but we want to try to avoid it as much as possible when we are exercising critical thinking. So I want you to think about this. If you're in a context where you're noticing vagueness, you can develop the skill of asking good clarifying questions. So like you can say, oh, by this term here, we'll call it X. Do you mean Y or Z or something else? Right? Those are really good skills to develop in critical thinking. These are foundational skills. Like, what do you really mean by this term over here? And being able to spot which terms are the vague terms, that's also a knack. It's something that you just have to like look at these problem sets repeatedly, and you'll develop that. Basically, the clearer you can get at your own critical thinking, the better you're going to be able to spot vagueness in other people's thinking and then ask those questions. Not to be a jerk or anything, but just to ask them in a healthy and a productive way. Now, there's a way we can be ambiguous. And keep in mind, ambiguity is when there's multiple meanings on the table. And it often arises just from what we call grammatical ambiguity. And this is from just the way a sentence is strung together. And some of these are really silly and childish examples, but these are instances of grammatical ambiguity. So here's a sentence: Lord Dennig spoke against the artificial insemination of women in the House of Lords. So this is ambiguous. It's not ambiguous in normal use because we know what is meant by this. But as a matter of fact, the grammar could mean either that Lord Dennig spoke in the House of Lords, or he spoke against the artificial insemination of women in the House of the Lords. So it's not clear what's happening in the House of Lords. Is it the artificial insemination of women, which is extremely unlikely, of course, and silly to even think about. But as a matter of fact, the grammar doesn't tell us this. It's just our common sense tells us that that's probably not what he meant. But the sentence could mean that the artificial insemination of women is happening in the House of Lords, or Lord Dennig is speaking in the House of the Lords. So keep that in mind. A silly example, to be sure, but it does show that there is times where there's grammatical ambiguity, and sometimes it can be really important. You can often spot this in different, I've noticed this in different sports rule books, like the NCAA sports rule books are super ambiguous. If you go look at some of their sports rulings, I don't have any off the top of my head right now, on what are penalties and what are not penalties, there's often so much ambiguity because you're not sure which sentence goes with which, and so be aware that this does happen in a very serious way too, not just in these silly ways over here. Now, it's important to be able to spot ambiguities. But just keep in mind that folks who point out every single ambiguous sentence are super annoying, because oftentimes language, as you know, we're adopting this meaning as use, and context kind of tells us what people mean. Often enough, we don't mean things literally, but we're trying to get a single point across. We don't need to be like super keen on pointing out every single ambiguity. We're only interested in pointing out ambiguities that can or in fact are misleading to other people in an argument. So don't point out every single ambiguity, but just find the ambiguities that have some sort of importance in an argument because they're misleading, when people actually do find them confusing. Okay, so now I want to talk about description and evaluation and meaning. So some words have both a descriptive and an evaluative meaning. We already talked about this in the last lecture, but we're revisiting it now to sort of piece out and to sort of like clarify when things are happening at the same time. So the word renowned can mean well known as a description, and it can mean good as an evaluation. Keep in mind, last lecture I said some sentences are evaluative, some are descriptive. Now I'm saying sometimes they're both, right? And that can be sometimes confusing. So here's an example. Kreisler is a renowned violinist. This is just a sentence from the textbook. So it describes a fact, the fact that lots of people know who Kreisler is as a violinist, and it evaluates him. He's an excellent violinist. I'm assuming it's a he, for no particular reason. Now, the textbook points out that if you, in fact, don't think Kreisler is an excellent violinist, you might agree with the descriptive renowned part. You might agree that he's well known, but you might disagree that Kreisler's all that good, right? You might think that his fame is ill-gotten or something like that. So you may agree with the descriptive content, but you may disagree with the evaluative content of renowned here. Notorious is a similar word that means well-known and bad, so it's a negative valuation. And it's important in critical thinking contexts because we want to focus on the facts as separate from the evaluation, and we want to separate them as much as possible when we're doing critical thinking. So here are some examples that you can kind of think through. The sentence, he is very self-confident, is sort of a neutral descriptive meaning, whereas he is arrogant, sort of like it means the same thing, but it adds sort of a negative connotation to it. Similarly with the sentence, she is sexually liberated and she is promiscuous. One of those is much more descriptive, and one of them might even be positive, and one of them might even be negative. He is a dedicated conservative, and he is a fanatical conservative. Those are, dedicated is pretty clearly, it's somewhat positive as well. Fanatical is definitely like a negative connotation, right? So using evaluative language, this can subtly change how someone perceives the truth or falsity of an important situation. It's sort of like we have to be careful that we're not using emotively charged language to subtly change what people think about things, right? So we want to be as sort of descriptive as possible and as sort of like low on the evaluative content of our words as much as possible. Okay, so here's self-test number 6 from your textbook, and it says to find words with neutral valuation but preserves the descriptive meaning of the sentence. So they have this sentence here: Jennifer is a compulsively tidy person. Compulsively has a negative connotation, suggests that she has a problem. You could say that she is a consistently tidy person, right? That's much more neutral, I guess. Consistency sort of has a positive evaluation too, but I'd say for the most part, it's pretty descriptive and neutral. So I would say consistently here. The next one says the governor announced that the budget for social services would be slashed by 12% over the next 3 years. Slashed clearly has a negative connotation. It suggests that this shouldn't be happening, right? But I mean, who's to say that it shouldn't be happening? I'm trying to think of a word here. You could just say reduced. Of course, like in the media, they're going to use all sorts of like emotive language and evaluative language to kind of get their point across. And to kind of be provocative. But I think reduced is a good neutral word for slashed here. How about this one? John was suckered by the salesman into buying the car. Suckered is clearly negative. It suggests, I think, that John was sort of like weak-minded or something like that. I think even the word tricked here would do better, because tricked means, it's not like you're saying, like when you say John was suckered, you're kind of saying he's a sucker. Whereas if you say John was tricked, you might think like, oh man, like someone pulled a fast one on him. You're not suggesting there's anything wrong with John. Clearly the salesman in whatever way you describe the sentence in the descriptive form is doing something shady. So if you say John was tricked by the salesman into buying the car, that's probably being more accurate to the situation here. Okay. The next thing I want to discuss is what are called necessary and sufficient conditions. And these are particular forms of ambiguities that we want to get clear on. I'll say that up until now, this is going to be the hardest thing you learn, and it's like sort of like a mind trick. And my goal is to walk you through it as carefully as possible. Once you start to see it, and you're going to do the problem test to really get comfortable doing them. But once you see them, you should get pretty comfortable with it. But it might take you a bit to kind of fully grasp what's going on. So there's a particular kind of ambiguity that occurs when we're talking about conditions that have to be met for something to be true. We're talking about conditions here. And so consider this statement here. Being at least 18 years of age is a condition for being eligible to vote in federal elections in the USA. That happens to be true, but there's multiple ways we can understand what the condition, how the condition is operating here. So this could mean anyone who is at least 18 years of age is eligible to vote in the federal elections in the USA. Or it could mean anyone who is not at least 18 years of age is not eligible to vote in federal elections in the USA. I'm not going to explain why those are different just now, but you can see sort of the difference there, right? But I'm going to try to make it more clear in a second. So when we think about it in terms of one, we're saying anyone who's 18, they can vote. If you're 18, you're good. That's good enough to vote. And number two, you're saying, no, what we mean is that if you're eligible to vote, then you must be 18. But there may be other conditions you have to meet in order to vote, right? So actually, one is much more permissive. Number two could potentially introduce more restrictions or more conditions. But that might not be super clear just yet, and so I respect that. That's probably what's happening right now. But hang on a second, and we'll clarify this considerably. When we look at this in point of fact, being at least 18 years of age is a condition for being eligible to vote in the federal elections in the USA. We know this because there's more conditions that have to be met than just this. You have to be a U.S. citizen as well, for instance. So this is actually what we call a necessary condition. So it's a specific type of condition, and then we can get really clear on it. A necessary condition is something that needs to be met in order for something else to happen, but it doesn't guarantee that the other thing can happen, right? So you need to be 18 years of age to vote in the US. That needs to be true, but it doesn't guarantee that you can vote in the US, right? So that's what a necessary condition is. We can define it as X is a necessary condition for Y if and only if when X is false, Y must also be false, or when X is absent, Y cannot occur. So in going back to this definition or this expression of a condition, what we know is, as a necessary condition, if you're not 18 years of age, then you cannot vote, right? So we know that that's a necessary condition. But it's not what we'd call a sufficient condition because it doesn't guarantee that you can vote just because you're 18, right? You also have to be a citizen, for instance. So just to recap, a necessary condition stipulates something that must be the case, a necessary condition, but it doesn't guarantee that the result can be met. The truth test for a necessary condition statement, look for a Y that is not also an X. So, and that will tell you if the necessary condition is not true. So this necessary definition up here actually is, necessary condition actually is true because you can't find a Y, someone who's eligible to vote in the US, who isn't also an X, being 18 years of age or older, right? And so that's why we know that this actually is true. It is a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition, doesn't guarantee you can vote, but it is a necessary definition, a necessary condition that must be met if you're going to vote in the US. You're probably somewhat clearer now, somewhat a little bit hazy. That's okay. Bear with me. It might take a few more slides before you get comfortable, but I promise you will get more comfortable in a minute. We can juxtapose necessary and sufficient conditions with one another. So a sufficient condition guarantees that the outcome is going to happen. So X is a sufficient condition for Y if and only if, when X is true, then Y must also be true, or when X is present, Y must occur. So a truth test for a sufficient condition is look for an instance of X that is not also a Y. In other words, if you can find, if someone is saying X is a sufficient condition for Y, but you can find an X that isn't also a Y, or that Y doesn't also happen, then it would be false. It wouldn't actually be a sufficient condition. Here's an example of a sufficient condition. If today is Tuesday, tomorrow is Wednesday. So I'm saying something slightly stronger here, I guess, than a necessary condition. I'm saying if on any day, if you can say it's Tuesday, that guarantees that tomorrow is going to be Wednesday. So that's a sufficient condition, right? So a necessary condition is slightly different. It just says you need this to be true for this to be true. A sufficient condition says if this is true, then you're guaranteed to have this other thing being true as well. So it's a different type of condition. Okay, so you're still probably a little confused. That's okay. You're still probably a little hazy. I'm going to walk you through a few examples, and hopefully this will help to clarify necessary and sufficient conditions. So self-test number 7 says which of the following express a necessary condition for or a sufficient condition or a combination of the two. Okay, so number 1 says to bring down a fever, apply a cloth dampened in cold water to the patient's face, arms, and legs. So we're treating the italicized as a condition. So apply a cloth dampened in cold water to the patient's face, arms, and legs. And then the consequent is going to be the Y. Here, the X guarantees Y, right? So if you apply a dampened cloth in cold water to a patient, it will bring down a fever. That's sort of a scientific law. Like, I mean, it might be a really bad fever, but typically this is guaranteed to do something to the fever, just, to bring it down. Every time you do this, it will reduce it slightly at least. It might not bring it to non-fever state, but if it's at like 105 degrees or something, and you put all these cold cloths all over them, it will probably go down to 104.5 at minimum. So it's guaranteed to work. And so, since X guarantees Y, the italicized guarantees the non-italicized, it's a sufficient condition, right? Guaranteeing the outcome. But here's the thing, there are other ways to bring down a fever, so it's not a necessary condition. So you don't need to do this in order to bring down a fever. So this would be a sufficient, not a necessary condition. How do we know? Well, because you could also bring down a fever by giving someone Advil, right? So you can give a patient Advil, that would also bring down a fever, right? So both of those, in fact, are sufficient conditions, neither of which are necessary conditions, right? So because there are other ways to do it. So you don't need to do this to bring down a fever in the example, but you can do it and it'll guarantee bringing down a fever. So therefore, sufficient condition, X guarantees Y, not a necessary condition because you don't need to do this to get Y. Hopefully that's starting to clarify things. Let's look at a few more. So to be admitted as a graduate student, applicants must have a 4-year honors degree with a 75% average on all courses taken in their last 2 years. Here, X does not guarantee Y. Just because you have a 4-year honors degree and a 75% average on all your courses, it doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to be admitted in this, at least not typically, right? no graduate program that I know of takes all of their applicants, right? And so these are minimum requirements. So X here does not guarantee Y, so it's not a sufficient condition, right? But if X was false, if the application did not occur, sorry, if the applicant did not have the 4 years on a degree and a 75% on average on all courses taken in the last 2 years, if those didn't happen, then Y could not occur, right? So what we're stipulating here is a necessary condition. We're saying in order to apply, in order to be admitted, this must be the case. So this in the italics here, applicants must have a 4-year honors degree with a 75% average on all courses taken in the last 2 years. Necessary condition. That must be in place in order for the possibility even of getting into our program. But it's not going to guarantee you admittance into our program, so it's not a sufficient condition. Hopefully this is starting to make sense. Okay, you cannot get an A average unless you work hard through the whole year. So X here is work hard, and this does not guarantee Y an A average. So it's not a sufficient condition, right? Just because you work hard throughout the whole term doesn't guarantee that you're going to get an A, right? But if X were false, if you didn't work hard throughout the whole term, then Y would also be false. And so what we have here is a necessary condition. What we're saying is that it's necessary to work hard through the whole term to get an A. It's not sufficient to work hard. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to get an A. You absolutely must work hard. You probably have some other things to do as well. But just working hard isn't enough, but it is necessary. And so you have a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition. Let's see this one. Essays will be returned to the student without being graded if they are submitted without a proper bibliography. So the condition here is they are submitted without a bibliography. Does that guarantee that they will be returned to the student? Well, yeah, it kind of does, right? If you're not going to give me a proper bibliography, the professor here is saying they're not going to get they'll be returned without being graded, right? So X here guarantees Y, and so we have a sufficient condition. Now, is it a necessary condition? Probably not, because if X were false, it's not true that Y must also be false. In other words, if I do in fact submit it with a proper bibliography, this is what I'm saying here. If I actually do that, it doesn't guarantee that. Sorry, I'm saying this wrong. Let me back up. If X were false, so if I submitted the paper without a proper bibliography, it's not true that Y must also be false, where I would be getting a grade. That's what I'm trying to say here. There may be other ways for the paper to not get graded. I might have handed it in late, right? So it's not a necessary condition here, right? So it doesn't need to be in place in order for there to be to get a grade. Let's look at one more here. Actually, I think I have two more here. So the Bruce Prize of $500 will be awarded to the graduating student who has the highest cumulative average in all his or her philosophy classes. Now, X guarantees Y, right? If you are the graduating student who has the highest cumulative average in all his or her philosophy classes, then you're going to get this prize of $500. So it's a sufficient condition. It's guaranteeing the prize. But if X is false, then Y would also be false necessarily, right? And so we also have a necessary condition, right? So you need to be the graduating student who has the highest cumulative average in all of his or her philosophy classes in order to get the Bruce Prize. So here we have a really cool instance where you have a necessary condition and a sufficient condition. Very rare where you get conditions that have happened both ways, but here is where you get necessary and sufficient condition. Here's my last example. You can't watch television tonight, Sarah, until your homework is done and you've had a bath. So X here means homework plus bath. You got to get that done. And if you get that done, then you can watch television. So Y would be allowed to watch television. Now the two things together are going to guarantee Y, right? If your homework is done and you've had a bath, then you get to watch television. So they're what we call jointly sufficient conditions. If you just do your homework, Sarah, but you don't take a bath, you're not going to watch television tonight. If you just take a bath but don't do your homework, you're not going to watch television tonight. If you do both of them, you're guaranteed the possibility of watching television. And if X is false, it looks like Y would be false too. So if you didn't do these things, then it looks like you wouldn't be allowed to watch television at all. And so it looks like these are also necessary conditions. So here we have jointly sufficient and necessary conditions, right? These need to be met in order to watch TV, and they guarantee that you can watch TV. So this is the strongest form of a condition, is when it's necessary and sufficient, just like in our last case. But not all conditions are like that. So I respect the fact that it's hard to learn this online, necessary and sufficient conditions. But I would encourage you as much as possible to go through all of these self-tests on number 7, especially these ones, because you are going to be quizzed on necessary and sufficient conditions. So go through all of these self-tests, see if you can figure them out for yourself, and then go test yourself, check the answers in the back of the book, and see if you've gotten them correct. By way of conclusion, I wanted to just recap what we've learned. Vagueness is a statement or statements without a precise meaning. Ambiguity is where statements have multiple meanings. We've looked at the principle of charity, which says that we should interpret the most plausible meaning supplied by the context. You don't want to be overly charitable. You have to just look at what the context will allow you, how charitable the context will allow you to be. We've looked at descriptive versus evaluative terms. I suggested that we want to be as descriptive as possible in critical thinking, and leave the evaluation to the media, for instance, because we just really want to get at the truth of things here. And we do that best by being as neutral as possible. And we don't want to try to influence other people's thinking by using sort of emotive language or anything like that. We also learned that a necessary condition is a condition that must be met, but that doesn't guarantee the outcome. And we looked at sufficient conditions, which are conditions that they don't need to be met, but if they are met, it will guarantee the outcome. And then some conditions actually combine both of those, and you can kind of see how those play out in the examples. So that's it for the baby steps in terms of getting to reconstructing and assessing arguments. We will now, in the next set of lectures, look at arguments themselves and reconstruct them and begin to assess them.